What's up? This is Rebel Radio.
What up? What up? This is DJ Newmark.
This is Peanut Butter Wolf.
It's your boy. It's okay.
Keep checking out Rebel Radio.
Rebel Radio.
This is Rebel Radio.
We're in the place right here. Rebel Radio is going down.
Would you say Rebel Radio?
Oh, wait. Let's do it again.
Rebel Radio.
Hey, Phil Q is a music business legend. This dude has run some of the biggest record labels in the business. He was president of Virgin Records, Warner Brothers, EMI Music, worked with massive mega stars from U2 to Spice Girls to Janet Jackson, Linkin Park. He's been a big part of the music industry over the last several decades, and he's going to break down for us the ins and outs of what went wrong, how they got to the point they're at now, and as well as what happens next. He's currently running music streaming service Guevara, and I'd love for you to check out Guevara and post us a comment about what you think of it at Rebel Radio Net on Twitter. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Rebel Radio on SoundCloud and iTunes. And now let's get into the interview with Phil Q. Well, Phil Q, thanks for coming, man. It's awesome to have you here. I don't want to kiss your ass too much, but you are a bona fide legend in the music business.
Yeah.
It's nice to have somebody older than me here, because usually I got these young kids in the hot seat and I just feel old. So now I feel like I'm with my people.
With your peeps?
Yeah, exactly. But it's great to finally meet you. You know, I've been seeing you from afar for years, and you were kind of at the top of the music business when I was getting started, and so you're just one of those names that I've seen around. And the more I've learned about you, just preparing for this, you've had a really interesting career.
I've been very fortunate because I had very good teachers.
Yeah.
When you were growing up in the business in those years, you basically either went to there were two big schools that you could go to. There was the Columbia big red machine school,
Right.
Or there was the Warner Brothers school, and everything else kind of fell in the middle, the MCAs and Polygram,
Yeah.
EMI. But the two big schools were the Sledgehammer, Steamroller, red machine method, or the Huggy Feely, artists come first, Warner Brothers.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I always gravitated to the Warner Brothers side of things because I was always an artist-centric guy.
Mm-hmm.
But I was very fortunate because the schools I went to was the school of Jerry Moss, which was A&M, followed by the school of Chris Blackwell, which was Island, followed by the school of Clive Davis at Arista, and then very influential for a lot of years in the school of Richard Branson. So I took a different path than a lot of my peers and had a different pedigree as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, I want to hear all about that, and I've got some, I want to dig into some of that stuff a little bit. But if you would, take us back to before that, to how you got started in the music business. And I'm always curious what makes somebody want to get into music as a career.
Okay. My dad was the first full-time endodontist in New York. First guy doing root canals full-time in New York.
Oh, wow.
After the war. And as a result of that, he had a kind of interesting clientele coming through his chair. And over the years, he had Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and, Jimmy Dorsey. And, so my dad was a guy who would act like we acted as teenagers. He'd get up in the morning, and before we even had breakfast on the table, there'd be this guy in the living room blasting big band jazz. My
Nice.
father was a nut for big band and Dixieland jazz.
Yeah.
So we grew up in the house. I was the oldest of four boys, and we grew up in the house with music all the time. And when I was 15 years old, I convinced the guy next door, who was old enough to drive, I gave him $5 to fill up his gas tank.
Nice.
and we drove into Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx. We drove all over on a Friday and Saturday, and we went into every place that we saw, like a restaurant or a club.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I was too young to get in, but
Right.
somehow I managed my way in there.
It was a lot more lax back then, I remember.
And I handed out this card with my father's phone number on it. I told him I could get them bands.
What?
And
You're
then,
kidding.
then the following weekend, for another $5 full tank of gas, we drove around the same route, except I went anywhere there was a band playing and told them I could get them jobs.
Oh, wow.
Now, I couldn't do either one because I was
Yeah.
a 15-year-old kid
Yeah.
in 9th grade. I was out of my mind,
Mm-hmm.
But then the phone started ringing off the hook at my father's house, and I started cutting deals and taking 15% off the top, and that went on for about 3 days.
So you're a booking agent in high school.
Just a bookie.
Yeah.
A bookie. And then
Where was the permission to do this? Was it just you? Like
that
being
is
creative?
where the fault. That's where the problem came. There was no permission, and so my dad ultimately said, "Well, either you're moving out or the phone's moving out.
Yeah.
So decide." And
Yeah.
at 14, 15, I wasn't going anywhere. So the phone number got changed, and my first job ended.
Yeah.
So did you actually book acts?
Sure.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
That's fantastic.
That's-
what was
That's
it?
like the best
do,
story
do you
I've
remember
ever heard.
Do you remember an act that you booked?
No,
No.
none of them.
Yeah, because they're
All
just
of them
like,
and none of them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I get it.
Oh my gosh, so funny.
It was pretty funny.
So, where did those kind of balls come from?
I can't even tell you. I don't know if I was just delusional or like a lot of people my age, if you were aware in 1964, that the one demarcation that we all identify with was that Sunday night on the Ed Sullivan Show when the Beatles came off the plane. If you're old enough to remember that,
Yeah.
then and we were in the family room on a Sunday night, my brothers and my parents, and and I can remember that moment being a cataclysmic change for me. I looked at that on TV and I said, I don't have the slightest idea what that is, but I'm going to be part of it.
Right.
And
Nice.
I made at 6 years old,
Yeah.
I just decided that's what I'm doing.
Right.
That's fantastic.
So did your dad's career have anything to do with this idea that you can
No.
just
He
because
was-
you knew these artists, you didn't
No, well, he knew them as
subconsciously-
patients. He wasn't
Right,
hanging out
right.
with them, but
Yeah.
I know, but it's just so interesting that he's talking to those kind of patients, and you have
Yeah.
this desire to.
well, he was being a doctor, so he
Yeah.
didn't. It didn't really, other than being a fan and a doctor, it didn't phase him either way.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really motivating for me, And anyway, so as a kid, I got involved with local bands and did what I called was a manager, as much as you can be a manager when you're 16 years old,
Right.
Right.
and
Yeah.
lugging equipment around and
Sure.
You know,
Well,
and then-
and so what kind of music were you into at the time?
in those days it was all rock bands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So who was what
Did
were
you grow up in Long Island, in New York?
No, I grew up in San Francisco.
Oh, okay. But in New York, there were bands like the Vanilla Fudge and the Alessi Brothers that were from Long Island that hadn't broken yet,
Yeah.
and they were, so we were around those guys. They were the Rascals. I mean, obviously they were much older than I was.
Sure.
I was a little
Yeah.
kid.
Yeah.
But we somehow elbowed our way into the table, and then I went to school. It was then things after I left high school, things kind of happened pretty quickly because I went to college, and I went to school in Syracuse. And the reason I went to school in Syracuse is because I spent all of my high school senior year trying to figure out who had a music business program, and it didn't exist. And the nearest thing I found was that Syracuse University had a journalism school. And I figured if I went to a journalism school and I hooked it up with a business degree, that somehow that was going to get me,
Yeah.
Yeah.
in the mind of a 17-year-old kid,
That's better than probably a lot of these music
least you
business
tried.
programs.
Yeah. So I go to Syracuse,
Yeah.
and my parents dropped me off at the dormitory, and they pull off the curb, and I turned to the kid standing next to me, whose parents just dropped him off at the dormitory, and his parents pulled away, and we looked at each other, and I said, "Hello, I'm Phil Quartararo," and he said, "Hello, I'm Rob Light,"
Crazy.
Crazy.
and it was like, and we were buddies.
Yeah.
We lived in the same floor of the dorm.
So Rob Light went on to be head of music at CAA, right?
He's the biggest agent in the world.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we've been best friends for 40 years.
Yeah.
and he, very early at school, he was booking the shows, and I got into a college rep program. They had these college rep at the record companies at that time had college programs, where they would have students come on board and be promotion people for college radio stations, and we each had a territory. My territory went from Albany to Cleveland, working for A&M Records, Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss's label. That was the first job I ever had as a college rep.
Nice.
It was great. And I didn't get that till my second year. Halfway through my first year, after I met Rob, I was at the radio station trying to convince him that I knew what I was doing on a radio station, which I didn't know what I was doing.
Sure.
But it was, I was as good as anybody was going to be.
It's college radio.
It's college radio. And I ended up in a meeting, and everybody left the room. I was sitting in a room by myself, and I turned to the guy next to me, and I said, "I'm Phil Quartararo," and he said, "I'm John Sykes." And then
John
and then we became buddies.
One of the founders of MTV. Right?
John is one of the founders of MTV. Yeah. John was the president of CBS Radio. Wow. John is now the president of iHeartRadio.
Yeah.
And was the founder of Behind the Music for VH1. And John's had a huge career. Right. So John and Rob and I, as a result of that 3 or 4 years in Syracuse where we overlapped, we were best friends. We did everything together. I was the record guy, and John was the record guy, and Rob was the booking guy, and we all came out of school and went on to our lives, and we've stayed connected ever since. But it was just complete serendipity how that unfolded,
So how important is that? I mean, sounds pretty amazing that the three of you kind of had each other,
right?
And I always think, I think back to my own career and other people I've seen that. Having that group of people that you start out with, you're not necessarily working together in the sense of you're not partners in a company, right? But you're all there for each other and you're kind of helping out.
It is important who you associate yourself with. You can't predict who's. It would be kind of crass to associate yourself only with successful people.
Of course.
Yeah. But we were friends first and foremost. We all stayed friends. We were always friends above everything else. We all ended up doing the same thing. The punchline to that, of course, is that Syracuse really was not a music industry school.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
They had a television radio program, they had a journalism program, they never had a music industry program. The three of us went on to do this thing, which was kind of nuts.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, the nice thing for the three of us is that we then went on to create one of the first music industry curriculums in America.
Nice.
So John and Rob and I, so we've always been when we left school, we stayed on the board, right? We've always stayed on the Newhouse board. And then we created a curriculum that was named for the guy who funded it, the Martin Bandier program.
Okay.
So that's what it is now. Awesome.
Do you remember any records you worked at as an A&M
in those years?
College rep? Is there one that stood out?
Yeah, there were a couple of them, but none of which are going to sound too sexy. But in those days, there were records by the Carpenters, the Captain and Tennille, Styx, Head East. That was the repertoire in those days. Carole King. Yeah. We worked Tapestry.
Nice.
Which went on to be, the second biggest record of all time behind Thriller.
Yeah.
And but the thing that was good about A&M was that right after we got there was a guy in Hartford who was the college rep in our territories, kind of abutted each other at Albany, His name was Michael Plenn. You know Michael Plenn at all? Michael Plenn's a great promotion man. And he ended up being my head of promotion. Well, he was actually very involved with the IRS, with Miles Copeland for years. And then he ended up being my head of promotion at Virgin for many years, and we worked at A&M together for many years. But in those days, right about the time that all the Captain Tennille and the Carpenters and all that stuff, that's when Jerry Moss started going off into a different direction. That's when he signed the Police and Joe Jackson and Squeeze and really great stuff.
Sure. And then you went on. So if I remember correctly, you went on to Island, and then Virgin.
Island was after A&M,
Okay.
and that was for about 3 years. And then Arista for about
Okay.
a year, and then Virgin.
Okay. Nice. And then ultimately
And
Warner's,
then Warner's,
and
yeah.
then EMI.
Right.
So multiple people have called you a marketing genius. Why would they say such a thing?
Clearly, they're confused.
No, but talk about what that means in the record business. What? I mean, I know you're involved with Breaking U2. I know that
At Island, we get the credit for breaking U2, which is great. I don't know if that makes us a marketing genius. I mean, I had the tenacity
Yeah.
as a promotion man. The thing that broke U2, just to go off track for 1 second.
Okay.
The thing that broke U2 was a big rock band. When I got there to Island in 1982, U2 was already starting to play big rooms, and they already had.
Is that Boy? Where are they
Yeah.
at that point?
Yeah. So this is not.
Sure.
I'm not Christopher Columbus. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a big band already.
Yeah.
I can't take credit for that.
Right.
What I get credit for, what my team got credit for, was that we took U2 from being a rock band to being a pop band.
Yeah.
And the song that did that was on Unforgivable Fire called Pride, in the Name of Love, right? And that story is interesting because that would have been, I guess, 1983 or 84, but maybe 83. But, that record, we worked that record for almost a year, like literally 50 or 51 weeks, and the record was in the top 5. And the only markets I was missing was New York and L.A. And at the time, the program director at KISS in L.A. was Jerry DeFrancisco. And the program director in New York at Z100 was Scott Shannon and Larry Berger at PLJ. And they were both like, nope, we're not playing that. We're not playing that avant-garde hippie rock music here.
Wow.
And I was like, well, actually, you are going to play it. It's just a matter of when you're going to play it.
Yeah.
And so I got DeFrancisco to tell me that if I ever got Shannon on the record, he would add it. So I knew I had to get Shannon on the record at Z100 in New York. So they had sold out 4 nights at the Meadowlands. And Paul McGinnis told me, the manager of the band said, we're going to put 2 more nights up for sale on the Meadowlands. I'm just letting you know. And I said, can you estimate for me how fast you think you'll sell those out? He says, I think we'll sell it out in hours. I said, for real? He says, yeah, we'll sell it out in hours. I said, all right, I'm going to go close the record. And I called Shannon the week before they put them on sale, and I said, let me tell you something. And I'd been working the record for a year at radio with my guys. And I said to Scott, they're going to put 2 more shows on at the Meadowlands. And I said, if the shows sell out in 1 day, let's make a deal. If they sell out in 1 day, you add the record. If both shows, don't sell out in 1 day, I'm never going to bring the record up to you again. Never. He said, you got a deal. Because those shows are not selling out. Those are not my listeners.
Yeah.
And you got a deal. I said, okay. Tickets go on sale, and they sell out in about 18 minutes. Both shows,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
And
that's when you had to line up to go buy tickets.
Right.
There's no
There's
no back button.
Well, what there was then was Ticketron. If you
Okay.
remember Ticketron,
Yeah, for sure.
It was not that was not online, but you could go to a store.
Right,
you could go to a
store.
Ticketron outlet,
Yeah.
and it was
Okay.
Yeah. I used to go to Rainbow Records in San Francisco.
yeah. So
Get my
right.
Ticketron.
There you go. So the show sells out. McGinnis calls me from Dublin or wherever. He goes, shows are sold out. Thank you very much. I call up Shannon. I said, hey, Scott, it's Phil. He says, turn on your radio. Click. Right? And it was on the radio.
Wow.
And then like 2 minutes later, I called DeFrancisco, and he says, I know. I got it. Click. And that's how we closed New York and L.A.
Yeah.
And that's how we closed the record.
Oh,
And that's how we
nice.
broke U2.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So is that your approach to everything? Just
No. I'm not as cheeky now as I was then. But
So-
I mean, I was determined to get it.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I think you said to me, what does that kind of label mean that they call you a marketing genius in
Yeah,
the record
yeah.
business? I don't know. To me, it's kind of silly. But honestly, I think what that means in the record business is that you get the tough records. You get the records that people think you're never going to get. So nobody thought we were going to get U2 to pop, never mind to number one. Never.
Yeah.
Because they were a rock band. They were all the way over here. And, it just wasn't going to happen. I've had, 20 of those in my life.
Right.
Where people just said, you're never going to get it. And we get it. And for me, that's sort of like waving the red flag in front of the bull.
Right.
So it's like, no problem.
Yeah.
Bring it, I love that.
Yeah.
And what answers do you have that they don't have? What
I don't think
they
I'm any-
know that
I just-
you know?
I don't know that they don't know. I don't know that there's something they don't know that I know. I just think that I look at something differently. People see this, and I look at it like 10 different ways, and I just find the window in, just to get it done, because I'm just hired to do a job. My job is to make sure that we break the record. So I'm going to break the record. That's just what I do. So I never thought I was smart about it. I just thought that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing.
Right. And you didn't call it marketing. You were just making
We didn't. No, we didn't even. We were making it up. I never went to school to run a record company. There was no schools for that,
Yeah.
as we just talked about. But when there were all these. We at A&M we had a slew of instrumental records. Well, even at A&M we had Herb Out. I mean Chuck Mangione, Feels So Good. That was up when that record went to number one. That was the biggest instrumental that had ever been to number one.
Yeah.
And they said, you guys just got lucky. Okay. A year later, Herb Alpert gives us a song called Rise.
Yeah.
And we said, we're going to Chuck Mangione this record. And they said, never going to happen. You guys just got lucky. Take it to number one.
Yeah.
So, and then we had...
who's they?
Well, they is the community.
Okay.
The other
Yeah.
promotion guys, the other record companies, the radio stations.
And does it ever occur to you to listen to them?
Ever?
Yeah, because that gets me fired up.
Okay.
I love that part. That's
Okay.
like loading the gun.
Yeah.
That's
So
like
you're like, all right, I'll call you back tomorrow.
that's like putting the lead in my pencil. Bring
sure.
it. Let's
So
go.
is that passion, or is it work ethics? Like, where does that drive come from?
I just love music and I love what I do. To me, it's kind of sport. I don't. If it ever was work, I probably wouldn't do it.
Yeah. You
If
wouldn't
I ever
be
thought
as,
it was
like, tenacious.
painful or difficult, then I just probably wouldn't do it.
But it's just you.
I guess so. I mean,
Yeah.
it's very nice what you're saying, but I don't look at it that way. I mean, I appreciate it.
No, I mean, it's just, like you're not driven by like the constant no's. You're like,
I'm
all
driven
right.
by the competition.
Yeah.
I'm a competitive guy, so I'm driven by the competition of getting my record over the finish line.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can negotiate that, and sometimes you can't.
Sometimes competitive people, you don't remember all the wins, but you remember the losses.
Oh, listen, I can tell you, there's a song called "Tempted" by Squeeze.
Yeah.
Which,
Love that record.
Yeah, which we all grew up with. We loved it. I worked that record. We never got that record all the way in, And to this day, that record comes on the radio, and we all call each other, playing, and we all call each other, that son of a bitch, and there was a guy, and there's a very famous radio guy named Jeff Pollock.
Huh?
You know Jeff?
Yeah.
Or of Jeff? Sure. So, Jeff, at the time that we were working that record, I was a promotion man in New York for A&M Records. This was 1979. And I know you weren't. That's what that is.
She wasn't listening to radio at
Couple
that
years
time.
later.
Let's put
Yeah,
it that
thank
way.
you very much. So Jeff was the program director at WYSP in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And he just didn't want to know about that record. He just didn't want to know. And I had him surrounded, everybody playing it to death, and it was huge. It was getting sales and calls and requests. And it was just didn't want to know. So, and he never played it. Now, today, it's one of the biggest recurrent songs of all time, But that record was never, in its day, in 1970, 1980, was never a gigantic steamroller, drop-dead
Sure.
hit record.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is kind of fun,
Yeah. That's interesting. So, especially in music or in creative industries, but I think also, when we think about the tech business, which I know you're in now with Guevara, so, the lines, I think, between product and marketing sometimes get a little blurry. So when a record is a hit, history tells us that it was a great record.
Correct.
When a record was not a hit, history tells us maybe it wasn't that good of a record, right? And so the role of marketing is maybe hard to understand in that picture, right? And I think it's the same with technology, that we see these apps and these services come and go, and we assume, our gut is that the biggest one is the best one.
Right.
How do you see those two things playing together? Like, can you break a shitty record? Let's assume maybe not.
Well, it's much harder. There are certainly, let's say this, there are certainly shitty records that become hits.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that. Because there are records on the radio that have no business being listened to. That is horrible. They're horrible.
Yeah.
Okay? But the flip side of that statement is that there are songs that are absolutely fabulous that never get up to bat for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
So the truth is, my view is, the song, it begins with the song. If you have a real song that's a real hit, you know it right away, and it's our job to prove it. It's our job to get it exposed enough so that if it's on the radio, it gets call-out research.
Mm-hmm.
If it's in the store, it sells more than the one next to it. If it's on the radio, it gets played more. Whatever the barometer is, our job is to separate it from the pack, make sure it gets the attention, and it gets the chance to be a hit. That's what the job of a music company is.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, there was a day where our industry manipulated a lot of the industry to create hits, and most of the time, the hits are the ones that got through and stuck. But in today's world, the technology, to your point, is the great equalizer. It democratizes it used to be that there was a system. If you had a song and you wanted to bring it to the world, you had to go to a record company, you had to get signed, and you had to go through that funnel, and hopefully you got up to bat, hopefully you got the budget, hopefully you got prioritized, and at the end of the day, hopefully you had a hit. And if you could string 3 or 4 of those together, maybe you'd have a career.
Mm-hmm.
Well, today, anybody can put a song online. Anybody. A guy in a garage, my 12-year-old son.
Yeah.
So there's no filter there. So the job remains the same. How do you break a song out of the pack of the millions of songs? I heard an estimate recently, which I think I said to you when we saw each other. I hear that there are 1 million songs a day put up on the internet. That's not an unbelievable number. If you think about around the world, that's not out of the question.
It's not, although I remember, I think it was around 2000 when the industry was sort of at its peak and maybe starting, right? And that I read something, it was Billboard or whatever, that 28,000 records had come out that year through major and the
right.
actual
through releases.
Yeah. So to go from 28,000 a year to 1 million a day
is a big leap
in 15 years.
But in 2000, those 28,000 were only put out by record companies or by somebody who was making an official release.
Yeah.
Like I said,
absolutely.
I got 5 sons. Somebody's putting a record up right now.
Yeah.
It's what it is.
Yeah.
So that's the difference because, in I won't even waste your time with this, but everybody is now a composer.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Simple as that.
Yep. Absolutely. And everyone to some extent becomes a critic, right? Because, if you're my age, you relied heavily on the curators, whether it was MTV, for me it was
KMEL or
Source,
KFOG,
right, or the radio programmers,
or Bill Graham,
or the Rolling Stone,
Fillmore
or
West,
whatever those guys who decided out of those several thousand choices, we're going to narrow it down to these things to focus on, and we don't have that, and we argue sometimes about the difference between that system versus what's trending on YouTube or on Hype Machine or on SoundCloud, right, where all this stuff just comes in and certain things filter their way to the top. I think it's tempting, and the technology guys would tell you that they've built a system where the best quality just sort of rises. Yeah, I like that face.
I think they're delusional.
Yeah.
I think they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
In a sentence.
Yeah.
You know, it's a bunch of guys, but they can't wear their glasses straight, banging into each other in the hallway. I think they don't know a single thing about what we do.
Right.
At the end of the day,
I agree.
let me tell you about a marketing meeting I once had at Virgin Records. Okay,
Yeah.
I walked into a room. I got into a room late, and it was probably I can't even guess, maybe 96 or 97. 1996, 1997, but there were enough devices around at that point. You know, the internet.
Yeah.
That
Everyone had a BlackBerry or
it was starting,
Yeah.
you know, but it hadn't really. There was no
Two-way pager.
infrastructure yet. Yeah, right. But it was definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And I walk into a meeting and there's 40 guys, 40 people in the room having a marketing meeting, and what they're arguing about is the devices. Well, this one is faster, and this one is better, and this one sounds. And I'm like, so I sat down, I'm listening to them, and I'm thinking, what the hell are they talking about? And I'm listening, you know, so I let them go for like 15 more minutes, and I said, guys, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What you're talking about is inconsequential. Okay? Leave this to Bill Gates, leave this to Steve Jobs, whoever the guys were at the time. I said, that's not our business. We have two things that we do in our world. Only two things. We find and identify talent, and we exploit it and bring it to the fans. That's all we do. This is about distribution. That's all this is. Did we change our model when the consumer wanted to go from an album to a cassette, or from a cassette to a CD? We didn't go out of business. Okay, so we're not in the business of devices. That's for the device business companies. You know, we're in the business of talent.
Yeah.
And that's where that's where the music industry lost its way.
Yeah.
Because they decided they were in a different business than they were really in. And all of a sudden, they lost their seat at the table.
Well, so you've said publicly the record business didn't get killed, it committed suicide, right?
That's right.
By not listening
believe
to
that.
its customers.
And that's a hard thing for me to say, because my peers
Store.
have given me some heat on that, you know, and the people who I love
Yeah.
the most have given me the most heat. But it's what I believe.
So, talk about that a little bit. When you say that they needed to listen to their customers and they didn't, what does that mean?
The music industry is filled with, it's filled with people who understand that we deal with artists who create art. That's fine. But the business of the business is about transactions. It's about sales. And how does my record sell more than your record, and your record sell more than his record, and his record sell? That's the nature of the business, right? That's about driving. That's a hit business, same as TV or same as film or any entertainment genre. So, at the end of the day, what's the number one rule in retail? You listen to your customer. Number one rule. What's the number one thing the music industry did not do? They did not listen to their customer. We forced customers to buy 10 tracks on an album when they wanted one track. We forced them to pay too much to receive too little. We forced them to be inconvenienced when they wanted to consume music. There was only one way to get it. You had to drive to the store, and you had to,
Yeah.
And so and when the technology came, we fell further behind even faster. Because for a bunch of guys who claimed to be so progressive, the one thing we were not being at all was progressive, because we didn't want to hear about a different way or another way to talk to our consumers. It just wasn't in the playbook. So all these other shoulder and ancillary businesses were coming up around us, and we refused to listen to we're the guys. The RIAA sued the fans. I mean, how do you sue fans? How do you sue your buyers?
Yeah.
Like,
That's crazy.
what business is that? So
Yeah, it's basically giving up, right?
So look, I'm outspoken on it because I think that if the people who I love the most in this business thought about it, they probably would have a hard time disagreeing with the mistakes that got made, especially in the 90s. And I'm not critical about it. Like, I was there. I was part of it. I'm not saying the other guys or this guy or that guy. I'm just saying that as an industry, we missed the point.
Yeah.
And the point was to create the shortest line between the artist and the fans. That was our job.
Right.
And we didn't do it.
Yeah.
And that's where technology got to step in.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, that's a great point, and the reality at the same time is that the business has become exponentially harder.
Oh, yeah.
Not to say that your job was easy, right? But it's become much more complex.
Yes.
Right? Like you said, there used to be a system, and you either worked that system well or not, and you either had the resources or you didn't.
Yeah.
Right? But now there isn't that kind of system that's
There's no
such
system,
a
right.
direct line to success.
Right.
And I think in a lot of industries, that just throws people into chaos. I think,
Well, in this industry, that's exactly what it's done.
yeah. So my favorite quote about the music industry is when smart people do enough stupid things, they might as well be stupid people.
There you go.
And so I wonder how, obviously, these guys, and you're one of them, that, built an industry that touched the world, that changed the world. And so how do you go from being that smart,
To being
not you
that dumb.
personally, but, to making those kind of mistakes?
The same thing that led us all to the business in the first place is the thing that blinded us when the call to action came. We all got in the business because we had a love affair with music. Most of the people who succeeded and went pretty far in the business were people who were very, very passionate about
Sure.
music.
Sure.
As music. There were guys who came in because they wanted to make money, they wanted an expense account, they wanted to screw around, whatever it was. But that was
Yeah.
Later.
the real stuff was people came in because of passion. When the technology came, it was almost as if they were paralyzed in not even fear, but paralyzed. It's like, how could our sanctity be invaded? There was a sense of that. There was a sense of, wait a minute, this is rarefied air we're dealing with artists and art, and this stuff is crass. This is the lowest case denominator. I mean, this doesn't apply to us. That was the mentality, you know? And but people, especially in America, and in the Western countries, people want what they want, and they want as much as they can get for as little as they have to pay for it. It's just what it is. It's the Walmart. A big indicator for us was when, our music was not always sold in the big boxes.
Is it me, or does it feel like the music industry is always fighting somebody?
Look, I'm going to tell you something. The music industry gets a bad rap. Everything I'm telling you is the way I feel. But the flip side of it is the music industry gets a bad rap. I'm going to tell you why they get a bad rap. It is a very, very tough business to succeed in. Because if you sign 10 artists a year, the statistics are that only 2.5 of them end up in black ink and 7.5 of them end up in red ink. And of the 2.5, only one of them is going to pay for the other 9.
Wow.
So it's a very, very risky business. It's a high stakes business. You can go 2 or 3 years without having a hit. You can put a company out of business.
Right.
It's very, very high stakes.
Does it feel like there could just be better decisions made on the business side?
Well, that's the rub. Art versus commerce. Because when you say there could be better decisions made, what you're really thinking, and we don't have time to get for your thought to go all the way, but I'll help you get there. What you're ultimately going to be thinking is, why don't you guys have more hits? That's what you're ultimately thinking. But hits are determined by consumers. Okay, so you never know what's going to work. You never know what's going to work. Something could be doing... you just don't know. You think it's the greatest thing in the world, and nobody cares.
Right.
We signed Nora Jones as a jazz artist, and that first record sold 15 million records.
Yeah.
Not in your wildest dream could you imagine that. Not in
Yeah.
your wildest dream.
Right.
It just wasn't even in the book. So it.
Right.
I went to a meeting when the biggest corporate catastrophe in history was AOL and Time Warner. And I went to a meeting of CEOs, Time Warner CEOs. And I sat in a room with Bob Pittman, who's one of my oldest friends, who I met when I was 20 years old as a program director in Chicago, WLS. And now he's, king of the world. And he does this deal. And he brings in a guy who's the CFO. And the guy stands up in front of the music group and goes, we figured out what the problem is with the music division. You guys just need to have more hits. And I was sitting next to Ahmet Erdogan. Yeah. And he said, you are a genius. Come on, Phil, let's go. And then we get up and walk out of the meeting. Bob's like, no, leave.
Yeah.
It was like,
Sure.
Well, of course that's the answer, have more hits.
Right.
Of course that's the answer.
Right.
The other answer is spend less money having hits.
Right.
The other answer is when you have 3 big hits, don't spend money on the 4th one because you never know when it's going to,
Right.
Yeah.
It's obvious in retrospect. But when you're signing artists,
Well,
you don't know.
I get it though. It struck me. So I grew up in the music business, and then I started working with brands. Around 30 years old, and we were working with a big car company when I learned this statistic about 75, maybe it was even higher that I read about what percentage of records lose money, and I just thought, what if the car business operated that way?
What if any business operated
Any
that
business, right? And
Be
how
no
would
business.
you? There's no business, right? And I think we're going to challenge some of these stories that the technology infiltration of music is telling us, right? But another one is that music companies can research their way out of that, right? And there's all this hype about the data-driven record label.
But it's still, you can't underestimate the value of a song that makes you cry or makes you tap your foot.
Right.
Or that you're subliminally singing to that you don't even know you like the song. You
Which
just
doesn't really
can't
happen
put a
with
value on
toothpaste,
it.
does it?
Or toilet paper, or diapers, or perfume.
Right.
Yeah.
It's an anomaly.
Yeah.
Right.
Here's what I want to talk about. You were at A&M. It was in Indy.
Right?
You went to Island. Was in Indy at the time, before they got sold, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were at Arista as an indie, I believe, and then Virgin as a startup. And then you make the move to Warner's, and then Capitol EMI was Majors.
Right.
What did you need to change? What changed for you in terms of how you operate in those different
Why I
environments?
moved?
No. Like how do you
make the transition?
How do you make the transition
indie?
from an indie to a major label guy?
Well, let me tell you, it's not that tough. I'll tell you why. There's a reason. In my particular journey, I'll tell you why it was not that tough. When I went from A&M to Island, and then Island to Arista, they were all about the same size company.
Yeah.
And at that time,
How big is that?
30 releases a year, 25 releases a year.
Yeah. How many people does it take to run a label that size?
100 people, 200 people, something like that. Not a couple hundred people.
Uh-huh.
And they all had their share of big artists. A&M had the Supertramps, and 38 Special was having hits, and
Sure.
Styx was having big hits, and Carole King had a huge record.
Yeah.
We get to Island, and we're busting up. Robert Palmer had a couple #1 records with, and then U2, and we got to Arista, and that's right when Clive signed Whitney Houston. We used to go to New Jersey and sit in Wendy's and have hamburgers with Whitney Houston, this girl that he just signed. And
Yeah. Were you there? Was Bob Marley still alive when you were at Island?
he had just died.
Okay.
They had just put out Legends,
Oh, wow.
that beautiful record. So, so they were all about the same thing. When Branson showed up, his idea was, look, we're going to go start this company in America, and we want you to be part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I never, I don't know anything about starting a business, And he said, no, that's all right. I do.
Yeah.
I said, okay. We talked for like 3 hours, and he said, you're going to move to California. I said, no, I'm not moving to California.
From New York.
I'm not moving to California. He said,
And at the time, sorry to interrupt, but Branson now is everybody in America knows, everybody in the world knows who Richard Branson is.
Right.
At the
Well,
time,
he's a celebrity now. He wasn't a celebrity then. I knew who he was because Virgin was
right
an absolute contender in the music
in the
business.
UK.
Right, but I only
Yeah.
knew him as a record guy.
Right. Sure.
I knew of him. I never met the guy before he showed up, and So anyway, So going to Virgin was an easy transition coming out of those companies because the industry needed a change, and he was willing to take a shot with our team, the team that he put in place as the initial team, the inaugural team. And we did very well out of the box. And, candidly, the company was a mid-size independent that had a lot of hits.
Yeah.
And so it was not that different from an A&M or an Island. It ultimately became bigger.
Right.
But rewind to where we were talking about an hour ago. I said there were two schools.
Mm-hmm.
And the school that I went to was the A&M school of Jerry Moss and the Island school with Chris Blackwell, and now the Branson school. And these guys were all in their own right entrepreneurial, very, very entrepreneurial. So I had been trained, don't forget, by these guys, by Branson and Chris Blackwell and Jerry Moss, to think entrepreneurially. It was just the way I was trained to think about things and look at the world. So, but all those companies, ironically, especially A&M, was modeled after Warner Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
They were when A&M was built, and when we built Virgin, we modeled it after Warner Brothers because our view was everything had to run around the artist. So I always thought it would be fun to run one of the big majors, but I had already decided in my head that of all the majors at that time, which would have been Columbia, Polygram, MCA, Universal, I had already decided myself emotionally the only one I could ever run would be Warner Brothers because that was the only one that's what I was trained to do. I wasn't trained to run Columbia. I would need a sledgehammer to run Columbia. That's not what I do, or a machine gun. That's why I hired Donnie. You know, but I figured it would never come up, and I'd stay at Virgin forever. Mm-hmm. And then in 1997, it came up out of the blue. Quincy Jones called me up and he said, "I need your help. I need you to go over and I need you to come help us with Warner Brothers. We got a mess. I need you to help clean it up." And I said, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" He said, "I want you to be the president." I said, "The president of Warner Brothers Records? Oh, you on crack?" He said, No, I think that's what you should do." And I said, "Yeah, okay, great. I think I should play for the Lakers also. Now what?" So.
What was that like?
Playing for the Lakers? It was a lot of fun.
No, just walking into Warner.
How's magic?
After, they had like that, rough.
Upheaval.
Yeah, they just had a rough time, and then you came in to like save the day. What was that?
Well, I didn't think I saved anything. I just thought that I had a particular style of management, and I was an organization guy, and I knew that what I was coming into at Warner Brothers was that people had been there for a very long time. They were older and they'd been around too long, and they were just old and tired and needed to. Yeah, they just needed a fresh look. Yeah, and that's just what happened, and it was great.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the lessons that you got from those guys coming up?
You always delegate. You have to learn how to delegate because you should never have more than like a half dozen direct reports in a big company. Now, those are all multi-billion-dollar businesses. Yeah. And if you're trying to manage more than 6 people, you're not doing a good job. Mm-hmm. And you also need to have time to put up the periscope and steer the company. So that's a big piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle was that I spent as much time with the kids in the mailroom as I did with the senior people because I was trying to grow kids from the inside.
Who taught you
that? Branson, more than anybody. Because Branson is, when we met Branson, he had already at that time in 1986 when we started Virgin, he already had 100 companies at that point. Wow. And I remember sitting at dinner with him the first time, and I said, "How do you find 100 qualified people to run 100 companies?" He says, "I don't." He says, "I find people that I like, and I look them in the eye, and when I get up from my meeting, I either like them or I don't like them, or I either trust them or I don't trust them. If I like them and I trust them, I give them a shot. And the worst case scenario is that I make a mistake." I was like, wow, that's kind of scary. Yeah. But pretty freaking smart.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, does it feel like there's just this overwhelming fear of mistakes?
I think there is in everything. Mm-hmm. I think people are so... sadly, I think that is the case, but for the motive, I think is bad, because I think people are so consumed with me. Mm-hmm. Everybody's in the me business, And now more than ever, if I see my kids take one more selfie, I'm going to break their wrist. But it's like ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it's like you're so consumed with your own nonsense. It's like, God forbid you do something wrong. Who cares if you do something wrong?
Right.
Who cares?
Yeah.
So you learn from it and you do it better next time. That's the end of it.
Yeah.
Next.
Fantastic.
I think it's that simple, but you can't tell people that,
Yeah. So I want to talk about Guevara because I know that's what you're doing now. New, streaming music service. I guess my first question is, how do you take all this stuff that we're talking about, all these things you've learned, and how does that apply in this environment?
Well, it doesn't naturally apply.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of a guy with a shoehorn trying to make it apply.
Okay.
Because there's really not a lot of room for the artist in the tech world. So when I left, the last time I worked in one of the big companies was at EMI.
Mhm.
I left there in 2007. And I was approached by a few companies to do different things when I came out. Yahoo at that time was looking to do a music thing, and YouTube was talking about coming in to run. And in both cases, I said, "Well, how are you gonna pay the artist?" "Oh, we're not gonna pay the artist." I said, "Well, you know what? Then you need to talk to somebody else."
Yeah.
Because I just spent 30 years growing artists.
Right.
I'm not gonna poop on them.
Mm-hmm.
So then, about a couple years later, I met Klaus Oberg, who founded Guevara, and he said, "I think you're the guy that we should be talking to." I said, "Why do you think that?" And he said, "Well, because we've heard you. I hear that you kind of you want to stand behind that, and you've turned down some offers based on the fact they weren't paying. Well, we're going to pay the artists. We're going to have music deals."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, how are you going to do that?" And he said, "Well, where there's the fan and the consumer, the thing that used to connect those two things used to be called the record industry. Now that's crumbled. So everybody's been doing this dance to figure out how to connect those two communities. We think the guy that can be the pipe between those two is the brand community." And he proceeded to tell me about how they wanted to use their technology to create brand pages and brand relationships with the artist and the consumer in like relationships that would serve both communities. And it made a lot of sense to me,
Mm-hmm.
And so I got on board with that. I knew I had to learn. I was always an artist guy. I was always a marketing guy. I was always a branding guy. So I was never a tech guy. I'm still not a tech guy. I didn't like it then. I like
Got
it.
two phones. That's something.
Yeah, I hate them both equally. One's an AT&T phone, one's a Verizon phone. They both suck.
Yeah.
But I didn't have to like it, but I did have to understand it.
Yeah.
So before Guevara, what I did was I spent a year at Shazam. And Shazam, when I got there, was basically a company that was, it was the app that would, do its trick. The song came on, you hit the button,
Where's your Shazam?
and here's the song. The song is the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and it's
Yeah.
called blah blah
And
blah.
then you
And
buy
it
it.
came out in 1990. Okay, that was the trick.
Yeah.
And I said to them, and I said, "How many people you got using this thing?" And they said, this was in 2010 or 11. They said, "Oh, we had very very nonchalant. We had 2.3 billion hits last year," and I was like, B? That'd be like McDonald's billion.
Yeah.
So that would make you the biggest music app in the world.
Right.
And they said, well, yeah. And arguably they're considered now one of the 10 top 10 best apps.
Yeah.
And I said, it would seem to me that if you have that fire hose of music fans coming through this thing, it would seem to me that you would try and hold some of them for more than the 4 seconds it takes to do this.
Right.
To hit the button.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So, and they said, yeah, we thought about that, but it works and everybody's happy and blah blah.
Yeah.
So I proceeded to give them 3 or 4 different initiatives. That when I was there, they couldn't get to them. But happily, a couple years later, I started seeing things show up, which were very recognizable, which I was thrilled.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't be more proud or more thrilled that they were using some of the things that we spoke about. So
Nice.
yeah. So that was the beginning of it. And then Guevara came along, and I've been on their board for years, and the thing that's exciting about Guevara is that they put a big stake in the ground in Australia, which is great. And then we pushed our way into Indonesia with a relationship with Lenovo, and that's going very well. And for years we've talked about coming into America, and I've really advised, that maybe coming into America wasn't the best thing to do at the time in the last couple of years, because unlike Australia where there were a couple of music players, and unlike Indonesia where there were a couple of players, America had 20 players.
Yeah.
And
some pretty big ones.
And some big ones. And I said, what's going to happen is you're going to come into America. These guys are spending $150, $200 million a year just in advertising.
Yeah.
So you're going to come to America. You're going to spend a huge amount of money. For what?
Yeah.
To be number what?
Just to
number
make,
10?
Not even.
Number 50? To what? To say we're in America? So,
yeah.
I've always been a proponent of, excuse me, if you can't do something different or better, don't do it. As simple as that.
Yeah.
If you can't do it better and you can't do it different, just don't. So my advice was wait on America until there's a reason to come into America. Go out, and there's so many markets in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So we do Australia, Indonesia, India now is lit up big time.
Nice.
Moving into Russia, just those 4 markets alone. If you just look at Australia, Indonesia, India, and you're
Huge.
talking about 1.6 or 1.8 billion people.
Yeah.
That's a big audience to tap into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge brands. So you can make a business doing that. Make that business. And then when you show up in America, at least you have a couple of billion people in play.
Sure.
And you've got global brands attached to you, and that's just you're not showing up, like you're, the Avon lady.
Yeah. So why do you think Guevara has a shot now?
Because now I think that it could be the time to do something different and better. I think the world doesn't need 20 music players. There's Pepsi and there's Coke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't need 20 different people
I agree.
telling us how to stream music.
Yeah.
So there's going to be, I think, a big consolidation.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah,
if we'll
there
go
needs
from
to be.
20 to 2, but I could certainly imagine us going from 20 to 6 or 5, whatever it is. Okay.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, everybody who are the big players basically just do basic services. There's nothing sexy or exciting or different about a lot of these big companies going unnamed.
Right.
It's just they're just players.
Right.
Yeah.
So with Guevara, what we've tried to do is attach different featured programming things like House of Guevara, Fradio, and these brand pages have been very, very successful. And I think you might have seen the Harley Davidson thing in India when we were all together. There are good examples like that around the world of things that are separating Guevara out of the pack and giving better and different engagement for music fans. And that's really what we've been harping on, and that's kind of the story we're telling. And we want to keep telling because that's how we think we get separated. And while everybody else is going to go and consolidate, what I'm hoping is that we get to cultivate and nurture a future.
Yeah. Well, Fradio is really interesting. I did check that out.
That's interesting.
Right. And so anybody can kind of essentially create your own radio station where...
With your own community of friends.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
neat.
really cool.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think that stands out to me as different is really the brand involvement. And I know you've talked about that a bunch in terms of the role that the opportunity that brands have to play in this music fan relationship. Where have you seen that, work the best? What do you think is, what do you hold up?
Not that many years ago, artists were afraid of the brands. Excuse me, because nothing was cool. Nothing was cool enough.
Sure.
Right.
And then, we did things in the 90s, even as early as the 90s, where by choice, artists would say, there was this artist that had a record by a producer, it was called Enigma. Sade, remember that?
Yeah.
So that song was dead as a doornail. I was working on that record for months. couldn't get to first base. They put it in a Haagen-Dazs commercial in Germany, and the thing exploded.
Wow.
In Europe.
Yeah.
Then I was able to move the record over here, and I couldn't get it all the way in, but I got it to mid chart. And then when I got it to the mid chart, we put it into a Playboy channel, like bumper breaks. Record went crazy. So the brand worked. Okay, so that's a very small example.
Yeah.
Move forward to like 1996. There was a big Tina Turner tour, and we needed a sponsor for the tour. We went out and made a deal with Legs, because Tina Turner was always famous for her legs, even as she became an older artist, And you may remember a great...
Legs, the pantyhose.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was a great commercial they made of her strutting across the stage, but they would shot her from the waist down. It was just her legs,
Cool.
And it looked like the legs of a 20-year-old woman. And, at that point, Tina was already in her 60s.
Wow.
And it was like, that was a big story. And that was
Yeah.
a huge campaign. And it blew the doors off Tina's record and Legs, And then all of a sudden, and at that point, I was still at Virgin, but, we had, at that point, everybody said, well, where's my commercial?
Yeah.
It went from,
Right, yeah, sure.
It went from, like, on Monday, I don't want to be in business, I don't want to be K-Tel.
Right.
I'm too cool. I'm the Verve.
Yeah.
I can't be K-Tel.
Yeah.
And then, like, by Friday, it was like, where's my commercial?
Yeah.
Okay. Because somebody got $10 million in their pocket. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, and people have to see it work, and then
Yeah.
they get on later. I get it. What do you? Where are the places that gets screwed up? And specifically, what do you want the brands to know?
It gets screwed up less today because there's a necessity where there used to be a desire only.
Right.
If you could convince the brand that it would work for the artist and for them to be involved with the artist, and if you could convince the artist, hey, these guys, it's kind of a cool thing, you share an audience with then it was just like you had to create the love fest. It was out of creating desire. Today there's a necessity.
Yeah.
Because the necessity is that in an alignment that works, you could sell 3, 4, or 5 times more music than you otherwise would without the brand relationship.
Sure.
And the brand recognized the value of the cachet of the artist. So there's not a lot of room for it to get screwed up anymore because this has become a pretty well-refined thing, as you might imagine. If there is a place that gets screwed up is where somebody's ego overtakes their brain and they decide, well, I'm entitled to this kind of this or that. And yeah, but that's like anything else. It's just not just nonsense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard you talk publicly about kind of lifestyle brands, right? And so I'm wondering, does this make sense for every brand?
No, it doesn't make sense. Look, every brand can use music, but just using music it's a one-off opportunity.
Right.
The place where you have a real relationship. Do you remember when Sting was in the back of a Jaguar, by any chance,
No.
riding through the countryside?
No.
There was a Sting record that I wasn't involved in it, but I worked with Sting and the Police, obviously, for years at A&M. But then, fast forward, I was already at Virgin. But there was a song they couldn't get. It was after the Police broke up. Sting had a big record that was kind of mid-charting. They couldn't get the record all the way in. They were trying to find a spot to put it in. And a Jaguar opportunity came up. And they weren't sure if they should do it. So all of a sudden, here's Sting riding around the back seat of a Jaguar, driving through the Italian countryside. Beautiful commercial. And he's singing this song. Blew the record up. Completely blew the record up. And the record ended up being a big record, and everybody was happy, and Jaguar was happy because they had Sting in the back seat, and everybody lived happily ever after. But basically, after the 6 or 8 weeks of the campaign, it was done.
It's over.
There's no relationship, know?
Yeah.
So what's better is you take a guy like, a Ben Harper or Jack Johnson, and you align them with companies like Quicksilver or Hurley or Billabong. Okay, you know that they share the same customers, right? Same demographics, same psychographics. It's like, okay, this is a match that can go on. This is a relationship that can go for a while. It goes beyond a song or an album. It can go over 3 or 4 cycles, and really you can integrate the brand and the artist into each other's because you're growing a loyalty in that fan. That's the difference.
Yeah.
One's opportunistic and one is more.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So what hasn't been done, or where would you like to see that marriage of brands and music go?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer that's. It's a little bit of a. I don't mean it to sound like a tricky answer, but it's a little bit of a tricky answer because you get the next thing when I tell you what I want to see happen, then you're going to say, "Oh, good. How's that going to happen?" And I don't know the answer yet.
Okay.
But what I'd love to see happen, okay, now that I'm not running the big companies anymore, I work with artists who need my help, and I'm happy to work with people like Guevara and anybody who's putting music out. But for me, my agenda, my personal agenda, with everything I do right now, is to reestablish the value of music. That is my goal. That music has value. It's not free. It's not disposable. It does have value and it is important. So with whatever I am doing, whether it's in the Guevara world or the artists I currently work with or whatever it is, for me it's about how do I reinstill the value of this artist and this song for the consumer. So, Big Shot, how are you going to do that? I don't have a clue.
Okay.
I'm still working on that.
I get it.
But if you're asking me where I'd like to see these relationships go, where I'd like to see these relationships go is that the brand helps me tell their consumer that music has value.
Yeah. No, I get it, and I appreciate that that's not that simple to create.
Not that simple.
But I mean,
especially now because now I'm fighting a generation of kids who think music is free.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is
unless you're
sure
getting something so exclusive.
Right.
But
yeah. No, I totally get it,
you're
and
up against.
I helped build a branded record label for Scion, and we've pitched a bunch of we've argued in a lot of boardrooms that brands need to become the new labels, right?
I'm
and
all
have
about
an
that.
opportunity to just replace at least pieces of what those labels do now, and they have,
there is an absolute opportunity there. I don't mean to cut you off, but I will tell you that every brand that I ever had that conversation with loves the idea until we have one conversation. I tell them, because I feel very strongly about being very transparent about spending somebody else's money.
Yeah.
So I say, I want you to know that in the big businesses that we ran, this is the ratio.
Yes.
And these were guys that were doing this their whole lives and knew how to do it.
Yeah.
And they were only hitting
Right.
2 out of 10.
Well, yes, although, I mean, I talk about this stuff all day with you. I love it. But let's say, that is as a business that needs to generate a profit on its own from the sale of music. Whereas, a big consumer brand maybe doesn't need to have that type of financial relationship to the music that they could put out. They can monetize that in other ways through sales of their products, right? So, but I think I bring it up because I think it absolutely speaks to the point of, for the most part, what I've seen is brands trying to extract the value out of music, right? To say, here's a relationship between artist and fan that exists. Let's go get some of that, as opposed to
Like Pepsi with Beyonce.
Absolutely, right? We want to buy a piece of that cool,
right,
and have it rub on us, as opposed to
go ahead. I'm sorry.
We want to help enrich the experience that our consumers can have related to music, and to your point, like we want to make that valuable and add to.
So
that.
you're coming from my position, which I appreciate, that there is value in the music in its own right.
Right. Absolutely.
And as you probably know, you have to convince the brand that they don't want to have they just want the biggest. Right. They want the opportunistic relationship because you know what they want? They want the biggest name.
Yes.
With the biggest bang for the least they have to pay. Get me them.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what they.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've sat in that meeting.
Yeah.
So and it
there's
the
a time
biggest
for that,
brand doesn't
right?
mean the right brand. I mean, the biggest artist doesn't mean the right artist.
Right.
You know.
That's the thing. I think there's a time for that when that makes sense. But there's also a lot of other scenarios where that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I always say that people have this burning need to give someone money who doesn't need the money.
Hey, it can cut both ways. Before Beyonce, they had Nicki Minaj, which was a train wreck.
Yeah.
Sure. Those guys at Pepsi were like trying to slit their wrists every time that commercial came on, and they're like, "Oh my God, what do we do?"
I'm sure.
So they thought the cure was to go to Beyonce,
right?
And she ran out of gas once they paid her $75 million. It was like
Jesus.
Unbelievable.
So
it's crazy.
It's a very tough business it's a tough business,
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time. I have a couple last questions.
Yes, please.
Do you remember the first record you ever bought?
Yep. Roy Orbison, Crying.
Nice. Very cool. Do you remember the last record you bought?
Yes, but I can't remember the
Oh,
name
wow.
of it.
That's
it was
good.
recent.
Nice.
It was it will come back to me 'cause I bought it when it first came out. Oh, it was The Weeknd.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
He's
Very
nice.
cool. It's a great record. This is not a fair question, but think of a favorite live show you've ever seen.
That's not a hard question. For me.
Okay.
It's a tie between two shows. It was the last show I ever saw the Police play at Madison Square Garden. The last show they played in their first iteration as a band in 1980,
Wow.
before they blew themselves up, because the only thing they ever talked about was being able to play Madison Square Garden, and that was the last night they played together
That's
until
cool.
the reunion tour, and it was ridiculous.
Not bad.
Yeah, and the other one was Madison Square Garden U2 after we broke Pride,
Oh, cool.
and to see the song that we spent a year getting up the chart,
Yeah.
like blow the roof off that place was
That's
big.
cool.
It was big.
Yeah.
It was a moment.
That was not my first concert ever, but the first ticket I bought for myself was Joshua Tree at Oakland Coliseum.
Right.
Yeah, Oakland Coliseum. Unbelievable. Amazing experience.
Yeah.
Well, Phil Q, thanks for being here, man. I appreciate it. And
pleasure.
make sure everybody
Enjoyed it.
signs up for Guevara. And
Yeah.
come
I
back
think
anytime
Guevara
you
will
want
be
to
a
talk.
player very, very soon, and
Yeah.
coming to your town soon.
Nice. Awesome.
Okay. Thank you guys very much.
That was Phil Q. If you're not smarter now than you were when this started, then there's something wrong with you. I guess you weren't listening. Hey, leave us a comment on Twitter at Rebel Radio Net. Leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, Rebel Radio. And don't forget to come back next week for more Rebel Radio.